The Overton window and the right's red line. This video is in some ways a mirror image to an earlier one I did called The Overton Window and Informal Constraints on Free Speech. In that piece, I focused on how the left policed debate. Today, I'm turning to how similar dynamics are playing out on the right. Before I get into the video, I want to make something very clear. This is not an episode where I'm setting out my own views on Israel, Gaza, or Charlie Kirk. I didn't know Charlie Kirk personally. I didn't really follow him before he died, and I'm not here to say whether he was a good or a bad person. He was a controversial figure who drew passionate support and equally passionate criticism, sometimes from the same side of politics. What I do want to look at, however, is the meta level, how his choices and the reactions to them reflect a broader shift in political culture. To be clear, this is not about conspiracy theories. I know there are lots of theories swirling about his death, and all sides of politics are trying to claim him or weaponize his death and do all sorts of things with it. I don't know enough about any of that to speak about that responsibly, so I'm not going to suggest that he was politically assassinated or anything along those lines. That is really not the point of this video. What is the point is that we may be seeing the Overton window narrowing on the American right in the same way that it did on the left a decade ago, and for me, that is fascinating as a cultural and political shift, not because I'm necessarily interested in American politics per se, but because here in Australia we tend to be heavily affected by whatever happens in the United States. Let's look at how cancellation has traditionally worked. You probably already know it, but these are the basics. The Overton window is the range of ideas that are seen as acceptable to discuss in public. Anything outside of that is taboo. I mentioned already that I've got a whole separate video about that issue. For most of the last decade, cancellation is a term that has largely been associated with the left. From a legal perspective, we still have freedom of speech. You can say whatever you want, basically, subject to things like, defamation and that kind of stuff, and, security, confidentiality, IP. But generally, from a political perspective, you can say whatever you want. But socially and professionally, if you talked about certain topics, you risked real consequences if you stepped outside acceptable lines. For instance, if you tried to raise questions about trans rights, if you implied that there were only two genders, that's what I mean there, if you challenged anything to do with Black Lives Matter, or you took a particular view on abortion, unless you were absolutely definitive about being fairly leftist in your views, you risked being labelled as hostile, bigoted, and in some cases, literally a Nazi. Careers were damaged, book deals were pulled, and reputations were completely destroyed. So although the law said we had free speech, society said otherwise. And the mechanism that was policing us was not the government. It was informal censorship that was enforced by our peers, institutions, and employers. These were topics that you simply did not discuss with others if you didn't entirely align with the standard left-leaning view. Otherwise, you probably would be cancelled. During this period, figures on the right, a very big example was probably Ben Shapiro, positioned themselves as the champions of rationalism. His famous catchphrase, "Facts don't care about your feelings," summed up the posture. The right was about cold, hard reason, while the left was supposedly about emotion and identity. People like Shapiro were particularly scathing about identity politics, the idea that you had to stick with your tribe no matter what. The right mocked this, saying you don't have to agree with everything someone says just because they're on your side. You don't have to reject anything an opponent says just because you don't dislike them. Shapiro would make a virtue of the fact that he would criticize conservative politicians in the same way that he would criticize the Democrats. The posture gave them an air of being more open-minded, even if I'd have to say that in truth there were always unspoken red lines, like abortion or gun control, where dissent wasn't tolerated. Now let's come to the issue of Israel and Gaza. Historically, US support for Israel has been one of the few bipartisan certainties, and when the 7th of October attacks happened, nothing really changed. But as time has passed, the Gaza war of 2023 to 2024, cracks have definitely started to show in American politics, especially amongst younger conservatives libertarians, and the so-called New Right. Here is where the shift has become striking. Questioning US support for Israel, even mildly, started to get people branded anti-Semitic, naive, or worse, effectively pro-Hamas. So in the same way that the left used to accuse anyone that they didn't agree with as being literally a Nazi, it seems like any criticism of Israel means that you're going to be labeled as being in favor of a terrorist organization like Hamas. So nuance disappeared, debate was framed as betrayal, and suddenly I started to see that the right was beginning to look like the mirror image of the left that they had once mocked, given that they were the ones that were now shutting down conversation instead of engaging with it. The reason I have found Charlie Kirk to be quite fascinating is that he's a very useful case study. At the time of his death, as far as I know, he was still firmly pro-Israel. But in the months before his death, even though he did not come out and oppose Israel, he began opening his platform to guests who didn't necessarily share his pro-Israel views. For example, he staged a debate between strongly pro-Israel voices like Josh Hammer and critics like Dave Smith. He also brought people onto his podcast like Saga and Jetty, who is from a podcast called Breaking Points, whose views lean left. I want to stress, again, this is not about Kirk being brave or cynical. I think that we can all agree that he was divisive and people can argue both sides. If you want to take a cynical view, you could say that he saw the writing on the wall, that younger audiences, especially on YouTube and social media, are far less supportive of the Gaza war. From that perspective, platforming dissent might not have been principle. It might have been political survival or even just algorithm survival. It's entirely possible that he was principled. Perhaps he was genuinely struggling with the idea of cognitive dissonance, and he felt he needed to still be allowed to ask questions, even when something seemed like he wasn't supposed to be asking questions. Because, I guess in America, they're all about the First Amendment, they're all about their Constitution. So maybe he just felt uncomfortable. I'm not sure. But either way, the facts were that he was creating a space for debate. It looked very similar to early attempts on the left to allow questioning of previously untouchable topics. And what was fascinating to me was the pushback that he got mirrored the same resistance. And it was a very, very strong pushback and criticism. The shift is especially clear when you see the contrasts between the way that the various camps of conservatives on this issue have been treated. So we've got conservatives like Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens who have gone beyond nuance, and they are openly critical of Israel or ongoing US support for the war over there. So you can kind of see why they might be getting cancelled by their own side. Their side sees them as going rogue, and so they need to be shut down, and so they're cancelled. I think what's more interesting for me is that the conservatives who are still extremely pro-Israel are still getting criticised and quasi-cancelled just for asking questions and not having blind adherence to certain views. For instance, in a recent interview, both Kirk and Kelly held themselves out as conservatives who remain strongly pro-Israel. I think they even said they love Israel. They defended Israel's right to exist, and they have spoken out against anti-Semitism on US campuses. But both of them described facing backlash, even from allies, when they raised concerns not necessarily about Israel's actions, but how Israel was getting perceived internationally. Kelly has openly said that Israel's self-defense does not need to be proportionate. She's expressed skepticism about reports of starving children in Gaza. She positions herself as firmly pro-Israel, even as she might occasionally ask questions about their strategy. The reason she was attacked was because she said Israel was losing the propaganda war, and she quoted President Trump's earlier statement that it was time to wrap it up. She didn't seem to care about the emotional side of the conflict. She was simply affirming a long-held conservative view of America first and no more protracted involvement in long wars. Kirk, despite studying Hebrew, honoring Jewish traditions, and repeatedly calling for Israel's victory, has also been accused of anti-Semitism, and it sounds as though some of his financial supporters were threatening to pull funding from him if he continued to platform views that were not supportive of Israel. So in both of their cases, their frustration was not about disagreeing with Israel's cause at all, because they were still very much on the side of Israel. They were frustrated about being treated as traitors for hosting debates and platforming critics, or even speculating about geopolitics. So they were still loyal allies, but they were not allowed to show nuance because of identity politics. Ben Shapiro has been a particularly fascinating example. For me, he represents the immovable line. His support for Israel is unwavering, absolute, and blind. Any deviation from that orthodoxy is treated as dangerous, disloyal, or anti-Semitic. He is very much an example of a conservative who is unwilling to budge. He has gone from being an issue-based critic to being a tribalist defender. The cold analysis is that he's protecting his own identity and donor base. Zionism is core to his political and personal identity, so expecting him to suddenly treat it like a dispassionate policy question was probably always going to be unrealistic. But unfortunately for me, his credibility as a universal arbiter of logic is completely shot. The reason the above matters is that it shows the right splitting between those who want space for inquiry, like Kelly and Kirk, and those who are doubling down on their political purity tests, like Shapiro. And it's fascinating because it mirrors the same tension that the left experienced during its period of cancellation debates. So is this really cancellation on the right, though? The mechanisms are different, but in my view, the effect is similar. On the left, cancellation is enforced through institutions, universities, media, and publishing. On the right, it is enforced through the movement itself, through platforms, donors, and reputational policing. The result in both cases is the Overton window narrows and dissent becomes dangerous. The language shifts from disagreement, debate, to heresy. And there was a side note that I thought was telling. Andrew Knowles is another conservative commentator, and he only really started speaking critically about Israel after a Catholic church was bombed. It wasn't after the images of starving children, not after months of devastation, but it was when a Catholic institution was targeted. It is a reminder that sometimes the principle isn't universal, and sometimes the red line only matters when it hits your own identity group. And for me, that is still identity politics, even if it's wearing different clothes. So I never really was a big fan of his anyway, but that kind of reinforced to me that when he starts ranting and raving and frothing about identity politics, he should probably take a good long hard look in the mirror. So my closing reflections are that, well, where does this leave us? To me, the fascinating thing isn't about which side is right on Israel or Gaza. I'm not going into that. It's about the meta shift. The right, which once claimed to be the home of open inquiry, cold hard facts, fairness, is now showing the same patterns of closure and loyalty tests that it once condemned in the left. What makes it even clearer is that the mechanism of cancellation looks strikingly similar on both sides. On the left, we saw people lose careers or reputations simply for debating certain issues or even asking questions. The very act of wanting to hear the other side was treated as betrayal, as if you were showcasing, platforming, or endorsing those views. You were expected to gather your facts only from sources that matched your political alignment. To cross that line, even out of curiosity or to find out more information, was to risk being branded one of the enemy. Now we see the same position on the right, hosting a debate, platforming someone with a dissenting opinion, or quoting even a figure like Trump about the length of the war in Gaza. These things are treated not as inquiry, but as proof of disloyalty, just as the left asking for more information is equated with endorsing the opposing tribe. So I will end with the same disclaimer I started with, and that this episode is not about setting out my view on the political situations, or about Charlie Kirk himself. It is about observing the shift in political culture, about how debate is policed, and how the Overton window is constantly being redrawn. So the question is, as always, if both sides police their own speech boundaries so strictly, where exactly does critical debate get to survive in American politics? And I suppose, what are the implications for the rest of the world? Because when America sneezes, places like Australia catch a cold. This is a postscript that I meant to add as well. I know this video potentially looks like a criticism of the right, but I'd also like to say that the Charlie Kirk death has also been a case study about how extreme left-leaning people have also been quite hypocritical. I think there are a lot of people, the takeaway is that if you don't like someone, you may not kill them, but it's okay if someone else does kill them. I find that unacceptable. In my mind, and this is one where I will state an opinion, we have a legal system for a reason. If we want to kill another person lawfully, there are very strict parameters in which that should be done. And those parameters do not include whether or not I like that person or I don't like that person, whether they share my politics or they don't share my politics. From a purely selfish perspective, I don't want people coming and killing the crap out of me because they don't like me. So I don't think it's acceptable to say, I didn't like this person, I didn't like their politics, therefore it's okay that they're dead. And the way that people are getting out of it is they're saying, well, I wouldn't kill him, but I think it's fine that someone else did. So that's probably my most opinionated take here. Everything else is probably commentary.